You don't slap a stranger at a billion-dollar gala unless you believe power will protect you. The sound cracked through the ballroom sharper than the crystal glasses, sharper than the string quartet playing beneath the golden chandeliers of the Whitmore Grand Hotel in Manhattan. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned slowly. A waiter nearly dropped a tray of champagne flutes onto the marble floor. Naomi Brooks stood motionless beside the towering ice sculpture near the center of the gala, one hand resting lightly against her cheek, the faint red mark already beginning to bloom against her brown skin beneath the warm amber lights. Across from her, Madison Whitmore lowered her hand with the kind of careless confidence only old money could buy. 24 years old, wrapped in a silver designer gown worth more than most Americans made in 2 months, Madison looked less shocked by what she'd done than irritated that anyone was staring. "Maybe next time," she said coldly, brushing a strand of blonde hair behind one diamond earring. "You'll remember your place before speaking to me like that." A few uncomfortable laughs scattered through the ballroom. Not many. Just enough to reveal who was afraid to disagree with the Whitmores in public. Naomi didn't answer immediately. Around her, servers in black uniforms stood frozen beside marble columns, pretending not to watch. The smell of expensive perfume mixed with the sharp scent of champagne, soaking into the carpet where a glass had tipped over moments earlier. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain streaked across the Manhattan skyline in silver lines, blurring the city lights into something soft and distant. Naomi slowly lowered her hand from her cheek. Calm, controlled, dangerous only in the way silence can be. 38 floors above Fifth Avenue, surrounded by hedge fund executives, politicians, and luxury investors, she somehow looked like the only person in the room completely unshaken. And that unsettled people more than the slap itself. It had started less than 30 seconds earlier. A young black waitress carrying a tray of sparkling water had accidentally brushed against Madison near the ballroom entrance, barely enough to wrinkle the fabric of her dress. Madison spun around instantly, voice sharp enough to cut through the music. "Watch where you're going." The girl apologized immediately, hands trembling, eyes lowered. But Madison kept going. Loud now. Public. Humiliating her because she could. Naomi had stepped in gently, not angry, not confrontational. "She already apologized," she said softly. "You don't need to embarrass her." That should have ended it. Instead, Madison's expression hardened the second she looked Naomi up and down. The plain black evening dress. No visible jewelry. No entourage. No recognizable last name announced at the door. To Madison Whitmore, Naomi looked like another employee who forgot she wasn't supposed to speak. "Excuse me?" Madison asked. Naomi stayed calm. Kindness costs nothing. The slap came instantly after that. Fast. Stupid. Entitled. A ripple of tension moved across the ballroom like a cold wind. Then came the laughter. Richard Whitmore emerged from the nearby investor circle holding a glass of scotch, his expensive navy tuxedo fitting perfectly across broad shoulders, shaped by decades of boardroom victories. Beside him stood his wife Evelyn, pearls glowing softly beneath chandelier light. Richard glanced once at Naomi, once at his daughter, and smirked. "Madison," he said with a low chuckle, "you really need to stop arguing with staff during important events." More laughter this time. Warmer. Crueler. Naomi looked at him carefully. Not emotional. Not intimidated. Just studying him. Richard Whitmore noticed it immediately, though he couldn't explain why the look unsettled him. Behind him, a massive digital screen displayed the glowing gold letters everyone had gathered to celebrate tonight. Whitmore, Global Expansion Announcement. $750 million strategic partnership. The future of the Whitmore empire depended on the deal being signed before midnight. And at that exact moment, standing quietly beneath the chandelier light with rain reflecting behind her like fractured silver, the woman Richard Whitmore had mistaken for hotel staff reached calmly into her purse and touched the edge of a black leather folder, containing the one signature capable of destroying everything his family had built. For 3 long seconds, nobody in the ballroom moved. The orchestra near the marble staircase had stopped playing entirely now, the violinist lowering her bow as whispers spread beneath the crystal chandeliers like smoke. Naomi Brooks stood perfectly still while servers rushed quietly to clean the spilled champagne from the white carpet near her heels. Somewhere near the back of the room, a camera flash went off. Then another. Madison Whitmore rolled her eyes immediately. Oh my God, are people seriously acting like this is a tragedy? She muttered loudly enough for nearby investors to hear. Her mother laughed softly into her wine glass. Sweetheart, let the hotel handle it. Naomi finally looked away from Madison and toward the terrified waitress standing near the ballroom entrance. The young woman could not have been older than 19. Her hands shook so badly that sparkling water trembled inside the glass bottle she still carried against her chest. Naomi stepped toward her first. Not toward Madison. Not toward Richard Whitmore. Toward the girl everyone else had already decided to ignore. Are you okay? Naomi asked gently. The waitress nodded too fast. Yes, ma'am. I am sorry. I did not mean to cause trouble. Naomi gave her a small, reassuring smile. You did not. The girl looked seconds away from crying anyway. Security guards lingered nearby now, uncertain whether they were supposed to intervene or pretend none of this had happened. That was how rooms like this worked. Power decided reality. Richard Whitmore took a slow sip of scotch while studying Naomi more carefully. Something about her composure bothered him. Most people embarrassed publicly either exploded with anger or shrank with humiliation. Naomi did neither. She carried herself like someone used to surviving rooms colder than this one. Miss. Richard paused, clearly expecting her to fill in the blank. Naomi met his eyes calmly. Brooks. A subtle shift passed across the older man's face, though he hid it quickly. Well, Miss Brooks, he said smoothly. I am sure my daughter did not intend for things to become dramatic. Madison scoffed immediately. Actually, I did. A few nervous laughs followed again. Naomi glanced briefly toward the giant digital presentation screen hanging above the ballroom stage. The numbers rotated slowly across gold graphics beside stock projections and international expansion maps. $750 million. Singapore, Dubai, London. The future of Whitmore Global displayed like a monument to certainty. Richard noticed her looking. Pride straightened his posture instantly. Big night for us, he said. This partnership changes everything. Naomi nodded once. Yes, she replied quietly. It does. Richard mistook the comment for admiration. That was his first mistake. Around them, wealthy donors and executives slowly returned to conversation, though many kept glancing toward Naomi with growing curiosity. Nobody important in Manhattan looked that calm after public humiliation unless they knew something everyone else did not. Evelyn Whitmore stepped closer to her husband, lowering her voice. Richard, the investors from Zurich, just arrived. He nodded distractedly, but continued studying Naomi. Her dress was elegant but understated. No luxury logos. No diamonds. No visible attempt to impress anyone. Yet the closer he looked, the more expensive simplicity suddenly appeared. Tailored fabric. Custom heels. Quiet confidence. Old instincts flickered in the back of his mind. Wall Street had taught him long ago that the most dangerous people in a negotiation were rarely the loudest. Naomi reached into her purse then and removed her phone. Madison smirked immediately. What now? You were going to post about me online. Naomi ignored her completely. One unread message glowed across the screen. From Daniel Mercer. Subject, awaiting your final approval. Beneath it sat a digital contract worth $750 million. Richard noticed the legal formatting from several feet away. His expression tightened slightly. You work in finance? He asked before he could stop himself. Naomi looked up slowly. Sometimes. Madison laughed outright. Dad, come on. She is obviously trying to sound important now. Naomi slipped the phone back into her purse without breaking eye contact with Richard. Outside the towering windows, thunder rolled softly above Manhattan while rain streaked silver against the glass. Somewhere deep inside his chest, Richard Whitmore felt the first small crack of unease begin to form. Richard Whitmore had spent 30 years building an empire powerful enough to make senators wait outside conference rooms. But standing beneath the chandelier light of his own gala, he suddenly felt like he was missing information everyone else somehow had. Naomi Brooks remained near the center of the ballroom, calm and unreadable while conversations slowly restarted around her. The orchestra began playing again, softer this time, though the tension in the room never fully disappeared. Madison noticed her father watching Naomi and rolled her eyes. Dad, seriously, why are we still talking about this woman? Richard did not answer immediately. His instincts had made him a billionaire long before inheritance expanded his fortune, and those instincts rarely stirred without reason. Naomi carried herself like someone accustomed to power, not proximity to it. There was a difference. The wealthy understood that difference immediately. Across the ballroom, two investment bankers whispered while discreetly checking their phones. A hedge fund manager from Boston glanced toward Naomi 3 separate times before quietly stepping away from his group. Something invisible had shifted in the atmosphere, subtle but undeniable, like the pressure in the air before a thunderstorm finally breaks. Evelyn Whitmore touched her husband's arm gently. "Richard, the Singapore delegation is asking when the signing ceremony starts." Richard adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo slowly, though his eyes stayed on Naomi. 10 minutes, he replied. "We are waiting for final authorization." Naomi heard that. Her expression did not change. Madison laughed softly under her breath. Imagine being dramatic over a waitress getting corrected. Naomi turned toward her then, not angry, not emotional, simply tired in a way Madison could not understand. "You think this is about a waitress?" she asked quietly. Madison crossed her arms. "I think people like you always want to turn everything into some moral lesson." Naomi studied her for a long second. Rainwater traced silver lines down the giant ballroom windows behind them, distorting the Manhattan skyline into soft blurs of white and gold. "No," Naomi said calmly. "People like me learn lessons long before rooms like this ever let us inside." Madison opened her mouth to respond, but another voice interrupted first. Richard, a gray-haired man in an expensive charcoal suit, approached quickly from the investor section, tension visible in every line of his face. "Arthur Levine, chief legal counsel for Whitmore Global." Richard frowned immediately. "What is it?" Arthur lowered his voice, though not enough to fully hide the concern beneath it. "The board from Zurich is asking why Brooks Capital has not sent anyone to the signing table yet." Madison looked confused. Evelyn blinked once. Richard's eyes shifted slowly back toward Naomi. The name hit him instantly now. Brooks Capital, the private investment firm that had agreed to inject $750 million into Whitmore Global after 6 brutal financial quarters hidden carefully from public shareholders. Without the deal, Whitmore's international expansion collapsed by Monday morning. Richard forced a small laugh. "Their representatives are probably delayed." Arthur swallowed visibly. "Richard, Brooks Capital only lists one final signing authority." Silence spread between them like cracking ice. Naomi did not move. Arthur glanced toward her carefully before continuing. "Naomi Brooks." Madison frowned. "Wait." Her voice came out thinner this time. "No, that is not." Richard stared directly at Naomi now, every piece falling into place at once. The calm posture, the tailored simplicity, the complete lack of fear. Across the ballroom, several investors had already begun noticing the shift in his expression. Naomi finally stepped forward, the soft click of her heels barely audible beneath the orchestra music. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly. "I believe your legal team has been waiting for me." Madison's face drained of color so quickly it almost looked unreal beneath the chandelier glow. Evelyn instinctively reached for her husband's arm again. Richard did not move. For the first time in decades, the most powerful man in the room realized he had spent the last 20 minutes laughing at the one person standing between his empire and collapse. The silence inside the ballroom became so complete that even the rain against the glass sounded loud now. Madison Whitmore stared at Naomi Brooks as though the entire world had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. The confidence that had wrapped around her moments earlier like expensive perfume was gone. In its place sat confusion first, then disbelief, and finally something colder. Fear. Richard Whitmore recovered faster than the rest of his family because men like him survived by adapting before panic became visible. A slow smile returned to his face, polished and practiced. "Miss Brooks," he said smoothly, stepping forward with his hand extended. "I wish someone had informed us you had arrived." Naomi looked briefly at the hand, but did not take it. Richard lowered it carefully without losing composure. Around them, investors pretended not to stare while absolutely staring. Arthur Levine quietly wiped sweat from his forehead with a folded napkin. Evelyn Whitmore forced a strained smile that did not reach her eyes. Madison remained frozen beside the champagne tower, her cheeks pale beneath layers of perfect makeup. Naomi spoke calmly, her voice steady enough to cut through every whisper in the room. There was no need for an announcement. Richard gave a short laugh. Well, tonight is important for everyone involved. Naomi nodded once. Especially for your employees. That answer landed differently than Richard expected. He noticed it immediately. Naomi was not focused on the numbers first. She was thinking about the people underneath them. Thousands of workers. Factories. Retirement accounts. Families. Richard had spent so long treating the deal like a victory that he had forgotten it was also survival. Naomi turned slightly toward the frightened young waitress still standing near the ballroom entrance. You should take a break, she told the girl gently. Get some water. The waitress blinked in surprise. Thank you, ma'am. Naomi smiled softly. You do not have to thank someone for treating you like a person. Several people nearby looked down immediately after hearing that. Madison folded her arms defensively. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You are seriously trying to guilt everyone because I lost my temper for 2 seconds? Naomi faced her fully now. Calm. Direct. No. I am deciding whether your family deserves $750 million. The words hit harder than the slap had. Richard stepped in quickly before Madison could respond again. Naomi, he said carefully, testing the familiarity of her first name. Perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere private. Naomi studied him for a moment beneath the chandelier glow. She could see the calculation already happening behind his eyes. Damage control. Reputation management. Survival. You are worried about appearances now? She asked quietly. Richard ignored the sting inside the question. I am worried about professionalism. Naomi glanced slowly around the ballroom. Wealthy guests avoiding eye contact. Executives pretending to check messages. Investors silently measuring risk. Nobody had stepped in earlier when a young black waitress was humiliated publicly because protecting power was easier than challenging it. Naomi understood rooms like this well. She had spent years earning entry into spaces built to exclude people who looked like her. Professionalism, she repeated softly. Interesting word. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. Naomi reached into her purse and removed the black leather folder again. Arthur Levine immediately straightened, eyes locking onto the contract inside like a man spotting oxygen after nearly drowning. The gold Whitmore Global logo reflected against the polished marble floor beneath the ballroom lights. One signature remained missing. Hers. Madison suddenly stepped forward, anger breaking through her panic. Dad, are we seriously begging her right now? Richard turned sharply. Madison. No, she snapped, voice rising. This is insane. She is acting like she owns us because of one contract. Naomi looked at her quietly. No contract. Owns anyone. She paused briefly. Character does. Madison laughed bitterly. Oh, please. You are enjoying this. Naomi's expression softened then, but not with amusement. With disappointment. If I enjoyed humiliation, she said gently, I would have laughed when you embarrassed that waitress. Madison opened her mouth again, but stopped when she realized nobody around her was laughing anymore. Outside the towering windows, lightning flashed silently across the Manhattan skyline, illuminating the ballroom in cold white light for half a second. And for the first time that night, the Whitmore family no longer looked powerful beneath it. They looked exposed. The ballroom never fully recovered after that. Even with the orchestra continuing softly near the staircase and servers moving carefully between tables of crystal and gold, the atmosphere had changed into something colder, tighter, fragile enough that everyone could feel it. Naomi Brooks stood near the center of it all without raising her voice once. That was the part making people uncomfortable. Power usually announced itself loudly in rooms like these. Naomi did not need to. Madison Whitmore paced 2 steps away from her father now, arms folded tightly across her silver gown while embarrassment slowly curdled into anger. She could feel the eyes on her from every corner of the ballroom. Investors whispering. Socialites pretending not to stare. One woman near the auction display discreetly lowering her phone after clearly recording everything. Madison hated losing control of a room more than anything. This entire situation is absurd, she snapped suddenly. We are acting like she is some saint because she made a deal. Naomi did not respond immediately. She simply closed the leather folder in her hands with quiet precision while thunder rolled faintly beyond the glass walls overlooking Manhattan. Richard Whitmore stepped closer to his daughter, lowering his voice sharply. Enough. Madison turned toward him in disbelief. You are taking her side? I am trying to save this company. The honesty in his answer landed harder than intended. Madison stared at him, stunned for half a second before humiliation returned twice as strong. So that is what this is really about? She asked bitterly. Money. Naomi finally spoke then, her tone calm enough to force everyone nearby into silence again. No, this was never about money. Madison laughed harshly. Easy for a billionaire to say. Naomi looked at her quietly beneath the chandelier light. I grew up in a one-bedroom apartment over a laundromat in South Chicago, she said. My mother worked 16-hour shifts cleaning office buildings downtown. The room grew still again. Naomi continued without drama, without self-pity, just truth. When she came home at night, her hands smelled like bleach no matter how many times she washed them. People in expensive suits walked past her every day without looking her in the eye. Richard's expression shifted almost invisibly. Naomi noticed. She used to tell me something. Naomi continued softly. She said the fastest way to understand a person's character was to watch how they treated someone who could not benefit them. Madison rolled her eyes immediately, though the movement looked weaker now. Please spare me the life lesson. Naomi nodded once. You are right. Lessons only matter when someone is willing to learn. A nearby investor quietly coughed into his champagne glass to hide an uncomfortable laugh. Madison heard it. Her face hardened instantly. You think you are better than us because you struggled? She asked. Naomi shook her head. No, I think struggle taught me not to humiliate people for entertainment. The words hit the room like cold water. Evelyn Whitmore stepped forward quickly, pearls glimmering softly against her black dress. Miss Brooks, I believe emotions are running high tonight. Perhaps everyone should simply move on. Naomi turned toward her politely. Did you ask your daughter to move on when she humiliated that waitress? Evelyn's composure cracked for the first time. Not publicly, just a flicker around the eyes. Richard noticed it immediately. Naomi looked around the ballroom slowly then, taking in the marble floors, the towering flower arrangements flown in from Europe, the giant digital screen still glowing with promises of expansion and wealth. Do you know what the strange thing is? She asked quietly. Nobody answered. Most people in this room are not cruel. Her gaze settled briefly on the silent guests surrounding them. They are just comfortable. Comfortable enough to watch someone else be degraded as long as it costs them nothing. Several people looked away instantly after hearing that. Madison felt the room slipping from her completely now. She pointed sharply toward the ballroom entrance where the young waitress had disappeared earlier. She bumped into me. Naomi nodded calmly. And you reminded her exactly how small you believe she is. Madison's voice rose again. I said I lost my temper. Naomi met her eyes steadily. No, you revealed it. Silence followed. Heavy. Suffocating. Richard Whitmore suddenly realized something terrifying beneath the chandelier glow and rain-streaked windows of his own gala. Naomi Brooks was not trying to destroy his family in that moment. She was giving them one final chance not to destroy themselves. The rain came harder after that. Thick silver streaks slid down the towering ballroom windows while thunder rolled somewhere above the East River, low and distant like a warning no one wanted to acknowledge. Inside the Whitmore Grand Hotel, the warmth of the chandeliers suddenly felt artificial, unable to soften the tension wrapped around every table and marble column. Nobody was eating anymore. Nobody was drinking. Conversations had collapsed into whispers and side glances. Naomi Brooks stood near the edge of the ballroom now, slightly apart from the crowd, the black leather folder resting quietly against her side. She looked toward the city instead of the people behind her. Manhattan shimmered beneath the storm in blurred gold and white reflections. Millions of lives moving below the glass, while $750 million hung, suspended above them in silence. Richard Whitmore approached carefully this time. Alone. No smile. No performance. Just measured footsteps against polished marble floors. For a moment, he simply stood beside her without speaking. Naomi did not turn around. Beautiful city, Richard said finally, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Naomi watched rainwater slide down the glass. It depends who is looking at it. Richard exhaled slowly. Up close now, he could still see the faint mark on her cheek beneath the ballroom light. Shame tightened somewhere deep in his chest before he forced it down again. Madison was wrong, he said quietly. Naomi nodded once. Yes. Richard looked toward the ballroom behind them where investors pretended not to watch. She is immature. Naomi finally turned slightly toward him. No, she replied calmly. She is comfortable. The distinction landed harder than he expected. Richard rubbed his jaw slowly, exhaustion beginning to show beneath years of polished authority. You have to understand, he said, lowering his voice further. My daughter grew up in a world where people compete constantly. Status matters. Naomi studied him carefully. And you taught her that. Richard opened his mouth, then stopped. Somewhere behind them, silverware clinked softly against crystal as servers quietly cleared untouched dinner plates from nearby tables. The orchestra had stopped again. Even the musicians looked uncomfortable now. Naomi looked back toward the rain-covered skyline. When I was 12, she said softly, my mother cleaned offices downtown overnight. Richard listened silently. Sometimes she brought me with her because she could not afford childcare. Naomi's reflection shimmered faintly against the glass beside the storm outside. I used to sit in empty conference rooms after midnight doing homework while executives left coffee cups and food trays scattered across the tables for her to clean. Richard said nothing. Naomi continued quietly. One night, a man in a $1,000 suit walked into the room while my mother was vacuuming. He dropped his coat on the floor without even looking at her and said, "Get that cleaned before morning." Richard's face tightened slightly. Naomi's voice never changed. My mother picked up the coat anyway. Not because she was weak. Because rent was due. Rain tapped softly against the glass between sentences. That night she told me something I never forgot. Naomi said, never let money convince you that other people exist beneath you. The moment you believe that, you stop being human first. Richard stared down at the marble floor for several seconds after hearing that. In the reflection beneath his polished shoes, he could see the ballroom behind him beginning to fracture into nervous conversations and worried phone calls. Investors sensed instability the way animals sense storms. Naomi reached slowly into her purse then and removed her phone again. The screen illuminated softly in her hand. Richard noticed the unsigned contract waiting there. One button, one decision, $750 million balanced on silence. Naomi, he said carefully, whatever happened tonight, I hope you understand this partnership affects thousands of employees. Naomi looked at the screen for a long moment without answering. Richard watched her thumb hover near the approval icon. Outside the windows, lightning flashed silently across Manhattan, turning the rain silver white for half a second. Naomi's face reflected faintly against the storm-dark glass. Calm, thoughtful, heavy with something larger than anger. I know, she said quietly. Then she locked the phone screen without signing anything at all. And somehow, that frightened Richard Whitmore even more. Richard Whitmore did not sleep that night. Even hours later, after most of the investors had quietly left the ballroom and the orchestra packed away their instruments beneath dimmed chandelier lights, the storm still hung over Manhattan like a weight pressing against the glass. Midnight had passed. The unsigned contract remained untouched inside Naomi Brooks's leather folder. Around 1 in the morning, the Whitmore Grand Hotel no longer felt like the center of a billion-dollar celebration. It felt like the waiting room before bad news arrived. Naomi stood alone near the private elevator lobby overlooking the rain-soaked city below. The ballroom behind her had emptied into smaller clusters of worried executives speaking in low voices beside glowing phone screens and untouched dessert trays. Somewhere deeper inside the hotel, staff quietly rolled away flower arrangements already beginning to wilt beneath the heat of the lights. Naomi loosened a slow breath and rubbed her fingers lightly across the edge of the folder. Her phone vibrated once. Daniel Mercer again, awaiting final confirmation. She stared at the message without opening it. Across the lobby, Richard Whitmore stepped out from a hallway near the conference suites. His tuxedo jacket hung open now, tie loosened, the polished certainty he wore earlier stripped away piece by piece over the last few hours. He looked older suddenly, tired in a way expensive tailoring could not hide. Naomi noticed immediately. The banks know, he said quietly as he approached. Naomi said nothing. Richard glanced toward the city lights beyond the glass. Word spread after the delay. He gave a humorless laugh. Amazing how quickly confidence disappears on Wall Street. Naomi finally looked at him. Confidence built on arrogance usually does. Richard accepted the hit without argument. That alone surprised her. He stood beside her in silence for several seconds before speaking again. When my father started Whitmore Global in the 70s, he said softly. He worked out of a warehouse in Queens with 6 employees and 1 delivery truck. Naomi listened quietly. He used to tell me survival mattered more than pride. Richard's reflection shimmered faintly against the rain-covered glass. Somewhere along the way, I think I forgot the difference. Naomi studied him carefully. For the first time that evening, he sounded less like a billionaire and more like a man standing in the ruins of his own certainty. Down the hallway, raised voices suddenly broke the silence. Madison, this is insane, she snapped as she stormed toward them in heels that clicked sharply against polished marble. Evelyn hurried after her, face tense with exhaustion. Madison, lower your voice. No. Madison stopped several feet from Naomi, eyes bright with anger and humiliation. Everyone in there is talking about us like we are monsters because she wants to make some moral statement. Naomi remained calm. This was never about making a statement. Madison laughed bitterly. Then what do you want? The rain hammered harder against the windows now, filling the silence. Between them, Naomi looked directly at her. I wanted one person in that ballroom to say what you did was wrong before they realized I had power. Madison opened her mouth immediately, but no words came out. Because she knew. Every investor, every executive, every smiling guest had laughed along until money entered the equation. Richard closed his eyes briefly. The truth of it hit him harder than financial collapse ever could. Naomi continued softly. Do you know what scared me tonight? Madison crossed her arms defensively. Naomi shook her head slowly. Not the slap. Not the insults. Her gaze drifted toward the nearly empty ballroom behind them. It was how normal it felt to everyone else. Silence settled heavily across the marble lobby. Evelyn looked down first. Richard stared at the floor. Madison's anger flickered uncertainly beneath something newer now. Shame. Naomi's phone vibrated again in her hand. This time the message preview appeared clearly across the screen. Final window for approval expires in 5 minutes. Richard saw it instantly. His face tightened. $750 million balanced on seconds now. Naomi looked at the message, then slowly lifted her eyes back toward the Whitmore family standing beneath the dim hotel lights and rain-shadowed windows. Tell me something honestly, she said quietly. If I had really been hotel staff tonight, would any of you have cared what happened to me at all? Nobody answered, because nobody could. The question stayed suspended in the air long after Naomi Brooks finished speaking. Rain pressed against the glass walls of the private elevator lobby in steady waves while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline, softer now, farther away. Richard Whitmore stood motionless beneath the dim hotel lights, his reflection blurred against the marble floor. For the first time in years, he looked like a man with no answer powerful enough to save him. Madison folded her arms tighter around herself, though the gesture no longer looked arrogant. It looked small, defensive, human. Naomi glanced once more at the message glowing across her phone screen. Final window for approval expires in 4 minutes. Her thumb hovered near the display before the screen faded dark again. Richard noticed every movement. Naomi, he said quietly, I cannot undo tonight. She looked at him calmly. No, his throat tightened slightly. But I can acknowledge it. Naomi waited. Richard drew in a slow breath, the kind people take before speaking truths they usually spend years avoiding. When Madison slapped you, he said carefully, my first instinct was not to stop her. It was to protect the room from discomfort. The honesty landed heavily in the silence. Evelyn lowered her eyes. Madison stared at her father in disbelief. Richard continued anyway. And when I thought you were staff, he paused briefly, jaw tightening. I treated your dignity like it mattered less than our reputation. Naomi said nothing. Richard looked toward the rain-streaked skyline beyond the glass. I built an entire company telling myself merit mattered above all else, he said softly. But tonight I realized something ugly. His eyes returned to Naomi. I only respected your voice once I discovered your money. The words seemed to hollow him out as he spoke them. Madison shifted uneasily beside her mother. Naomi studied Richard carefully now, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet attention of someone deciding whether honesty had finally entered the room. Most people never say that part out loud, she replied gently. Richard gave a weak laugh, without humor. Most people do not have $750 million forcing them to confront themselves at 1 in the morning. A small silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. Madison stepped forward slowly. No dramatic speech. No tears yet. Just uncertainty breaking through privilege for the first time. Her voice caught briefly before she steadied it. I really did not think about how humiliating it was. Naomi listened quietly. Madison glanced toward the empty ballroom behind them where staff quietly cleaned abandoned tables beneath fading chandelier light. I was angry because everyone was watching me, she admitted softly. So I made someone else smaller to feel bigger again. The truth of it trembled visibly in her voice. Naomi looked at her for a long moment. That feeling, she said gently, is where cruelty usually begins. Madison swallowed hard. I am sorry. Naomi nodded once, though her expression remained thoughtful. I believe you are sorry now. The distinction mattered. Madison understood that immediately. Behind them, Arthur Levine suddenly emerged from the conference hallway clutching his phone, panic visible across his exhausted face. Richard, he whispered sharply. The banks are asking for confirmation. If this deal does not close tonight, the markets will know by opening bell. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Naomi could almost hear the weight pressing down on him now. Investors, employees, shareholders, pride, legacy, fear. She looked again at the glowing skyline beyond the rain-covered glass. Somewhere far below, taxis cut through wet Manhattan streets while ordinary people worked late shifts, cleaned office buildings, stocked grocery shelves, drove buses home through the storm. People like her mother once had. Naomi unlocked her phone one final time. The approval screen illuminated softly against her face. Richard held his breath without realizing it. Madison stared silently beside him. Naomi looked at the contract for several seconds before finally speaking. Your company deserves another chance, she said quietly. Richard exhaled shakily. Relief flooded his face too quickly. Then Naomi looked directly at Madison. But only if the people inside it learn what tonight was really about. Madison nodded immediately, eyes glassy now beneath smeared mascara and chandelier light. Naomi pressed her thumb gently against the screen. Approved. The confirmation tone sounded almost impossibly small for something worth $750 million. Yet somehow, in the silence that followed, it felt less like a business deal and more like mercy. By 2:30 in the morning, the storm above Manhattan had finally begun to weaken. Rain still traced soft silver lines across the towering hotel windows, but the thunder had faded into the distance, leaving only the quiet hum of the city below. Inside the Whitmore Grand Hotel, the ballroom looked different now. Smaller somehow. The chandeliers still glowed overhead, casting warm gold across polished marble floors and half-empty champagne glasses, but the energy of the evening had dissolved completely. Most of the investors had gone home hours earlier. The orchestra chairs sat abandoned near the staircase. Staff moved quietly through the room collecting plates and folded napkins with the exhausted rhythm of people ready for the night to end. Naomi Brooks stood near the private exit overlooking Fifth Avenue, fastening the dark buttons of her coat while the city lights reflected softly against the glass behind her. The faint mark on her cheek had nearly faded now beneath the warm lobby lighting. Near the ballroom entrance, the young waitress from earlier paused while carrying a tray of empty glasses. She hesitated for a moment before walking toward Naomi carefully. Miss Brooks. Naomi turned gently. The girl looked nervous again, though not frightened this time. I just wanted to say thank you. Naomi smiled softly. For what? The waitress glanced down briefly. Nobody ever stands up for us in rooms like this. Naomi's expression changed almost imperceptibly then. Not sadness. Recognition. Someone should, she replied quietly. The girl nodded once before returning to work, her shoulders straighter than they had been hours earlier. Naomi watched her disappear back into the ballroom crowd of cleaning staff and hotel employees, the people most guests stopped seeing after midnight. Behind her, slow footsteps crossed the marble floor. Richard Whitmore approached alone again, this time without the weight of performance attached to him. He looked tired, older than he had at the beginning of the evening, but strangely lighter too. The board approved the final transfer, he said quietly. Naomi nodded once. Good. Richard slipped his hands into his coat pockets as he looked out toward the wet Manhattan streets below. Yellow taxis cut through reflections of neon and rainwater while steam curled upward from subway grates into the cold night air. "You know," he said after a moment, "I spent years believing success meant being the most powerful person in the room." Naomi listened. Silently, Richard gave a small tired laugh. "Tonight, I realized it might mean being the person least interested in proving it." Naomi looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time since the gala began. Somewhere between the ballroom laughter, the humiliation, the silence, and the storm outside, something inside Richard Whitmore had cracked open enough to let honesty through. Not perfection, not redemption completed in a single night, just awareness. Sometimes that was where change began. "My mother would have liked that answer," Naomi said softly. Richard smiled faintly. "I think I would have liked meeting her." For a second, neither of them spoke. The city moved below them in silence and light. Somewhere in the ballroom behind them, Madison Whitmore quietly helped hotel staff gather overturned chairs without cameras watching this time, without anyone asking her to. Naomi noticed it through the reflection in the glass, but said nothing. She simply picked up her leather folder and turned toward the exit. Richard stepped aside immediately. No entitlement left in the gesture, only respect. Naomi paused briefly beside him before leaving. "Do not waste the second chance," she said quietly. Richard nodded once. "I will not." The hotel doors opened with a soft rush of cold air and distant traffic sounds. Naomi stepped outside into the damp Manhattan night, heels clicking gently against rain-dark pavement beneath the glow of streetlights. Behind her, the towering glass windows of the Whitmore Grand reflected the city like fractured gold. Inside those walls, billion-dollar contracts had been signed, reputations shaken, and truths finally spoken aloud. But Naomi Brooks walked away carrying none of the arrogance that usually followed power, only dignity. And somewhere high above Fifth Avenue, beneath fading chandelier light and the last whispers of the storm, an empire built on status had finally learned the difference between wealth and worth.